The Trump administration, immediately after the cold-blooded killing of a protester, called it domestic terrorism. We know what happened to her because it was documented by citizens. Facts matter.
Shame! Laura Poitras, Oscar-winning filmmaker, whose latest work is about one of America's best-known journalists, Seymour Hersh. Did you see him as a kindred spirit?
I think we're both looking for the truth, and sometimes that gets us on the bad side of the U.S. government. You know, it's a dark time, but we can't just lay down and feel in despair. We have press freedom in our Constitution. We have the right to be critical of government. It's not illegal.
From Bloomberg Weekend, this is the Mishal Husain Show. These past days have been searing for many Americans. A second person shot dead by federal agents in Minneapolis in just over 2 weeks. Both Alex Pretti and Renee were labelled domestic terrorists. And the conversation you're about to hear is with someone who knows what it's like to be seen as a security threat by her own government. Laura Poitras is a filmmaker who says that her work after 9/11 saw her being placed on a US terrorist watch list. You'll hear her tell that story to me, and the detail of it I found shocking. What it meant for her life, how she ended up leaving the United States. Now, several of her films have been about individuals of controversy or courage. Nan Goldin, who campaigned on the opioid scandal, the whistleblower Edward Snowden, the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. In our conversation, you'll hear her on today's citizen journalists, people like those who've documented violence in Minneapolis. And unusually, I ended up going back to her to talk again after the news of Alex Pretti's death, which of course made me think again about her words. First, though, her latest film, which has just been nominated for a BAFTA. It's called Cover Up. You'll find it on Netflix, and it's the story of one of America's most famous journalists, Seymour Hersh, who spent his whole life documenting power and the abuse of power. Not, in fact, unlike Laura Poitras herself.
He's a legend in investigative journalism in the United States. He's exposed, really dark secrets and hidden truths about this country. And his first really big story, which he received the Pulitzer Prize for, was a story about the massacre in My Lai, where the U.S. military went in and killed an entire village in cold blood. And they were civilians, including children and babies, actually. And over 500 civilians were murdered. And it's a story that Sy broke as a freelancer. That's one of the interesting things about it. He was at the AP, he was reporting on the Pentagon. People started to say things to him like Vietnam was murder incorporated. He started to hear some really disturbing things. And he just got a tip that there was going to be a court-martial of a soldier, William Calley. And he tracks him down. And through tracking him down, goes on a very long journey to expose a horrible atrocity, and also that it's not isolated. So this was, his first big story.
And you show this early in Cover Up.
In the film, we put it very early because we wanted the film to really be about, we're sort of diving in as it's moving fast. But Sy fell in love with journalism in Chicago. He began as a copy boy and then was sort of worked his way up in the AP, covered civil rights, and then was transferred to Washington.
You show how even before uncovering My Lai, he's working on uncomfortable truths like the US biological weapons program, and he has an impact in that program coming to an end. It's a very clever use of archive and Seymour Hersh himself talking to you.
Yeah, I mean, the film begins with this very notorious incident called the Dugway sheep incident, where 6,000 sheep die when the U.S. military were testing nerve agents in the air, and they flew too high, and the nerve agent fell down and killed the sheep. And then the U.S. military first denies it, and Sy publishes about that story. So in terms of the archival, when I began the film, the first question before I could commit to making the film is, will we have the archival to tell the story? Because I come from a cinema background, and I need to have the materials to have the story unfold in a cinematic way.
Yeah, otherwise without the archive, it's a lot of talking heads, which is not great from a visual point of view.
Yeah, because we had this extraordinary archival material, it allows it to unfold with images.
You're of course a younger generation than him, Laura. You do have something in common in that you've both won Pulitzer Prizes for your work. I also wondered if the key moment in history that you have in common is the Iraq War, because much more recently than Vietnam, Seymour Hersh does incredible work uncovering the torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. And I think you were working on Iraq at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'd known Sai's stories, and I knew of his work, but he really became on my radar in the years after the 9/11 attacks, where he was asking very hard questions. Why are we going to Iraq? What is the connection between the oil and the money? And what is the connection between the neocons and Halliburton and all these defense contractors? So I, in 2003, decided that I was going to make a film in Iraq. So I was preparing to go. And in the spring of 2004, Sai publishes the evidence of torture of prisoners in Abu Ghraib, which was in the New Yorker at that time. I went to Iraq right after that and made a film there. I was there for 8 months and followed an Iraqi family. Actually met the doctor at Abu Ghraib prison. I talked my way into documenting the prison after Sai's photos. And then I came back to the US and I called Sai and I said, I'd like to make a film about you and about your work and about investigative journalism. And it was motivated by a sense that I felt the US public was being failed by our legacy media in its coverage of the quote unquote war on terror, which includes Guantanamo Bay Prison, the Iraq War, secret rendition sites and torture. And so I really felt that the press kind of stood back and I think repeated the government's talking points. And Sai wasn't doing that. And he's never done that. And
yet everyone picked up on that story, right? Yeah. It was his words. It was also the searing images. And it became very clear early on and was widely acknowledged early on that this was appalling, inhumane treatment of prisoners.
Yes. So both in the instance of My Lai, first there was a phase in My Lai of the press denying it, and then the images came out and everyone had to agree that this was, an atrocity. And with Abu Ghraib, we also show how Sai got a first tip on it, and then this producer at 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes was sitting on the story because of government pressure. The government was saying, do not publish this evidence of torture, which of course for Seymour Hersh was antithetical to what you're supposed to do as journalists. And he actually forced their hand to publish. And then of course it was global news because it was, so disturbing to see the systemic use of torture. And Sai really didn't just stop at exposing the torture, but looking at how it was came from the top.
Did you see him as a kindred spirit, that you obviously cared about things that you knew he also must care about from the work that he was doing?
The answer is yes. I mean, I think we're both looking for the truth wherever it takes us without sort of fear or favor, right? I mean, and sometimes that gets us on the bad side of the U.S. government, and we've both done that. And so I think he respected my work. I, of course, respected his work. But, documentaries are different from journalism, but all of my films are really looking at people who are, bringing forth information that it shifts, I think, our consciousness. It's not just, he's not an opinion journalist, right? His best work is fact-based. It's fact-based, and it often leads to, very dark truths about what's happening in this country, about levels of deception. And we were interested, or I was interested as a filmmaker, is what is the connection between My Lai and Abu Ghraib and today in Gaza, and what are these cycles of violence and atrocities and lies and deception, cover-ups and impunity, really. I mean, because I actually really think that the problem or one of the solutions to sort of end these cycles is to end the cycle of impunity.
He has been wrong sometimes.
Yep.
Seymour Hersh has. He didn't believe that Bashar Assad had used chemical weapons against his own people.
It's not about whether Bashar Assad is a good guy or a bad guy, but this whole business that goes on with, we know he used sarin.
He was taken in by fake documents about JFK and Marilyn Monroe. He's been criticized as well for often using single sources and unnamed single sources.
And obviously we needed to include those stories in the film, right? That people make mistakes. Journalists make mistakes. It's very hard to know who to trust. So we did include those stories. In terms of with the Syria, I mean, I have friends who were tortured in Syria. I mean, it's not journalism that I would defend. In terms of the JFK reporting, he actually never published the forgeries. He did fall for them for a while, but he caught them before they were published. So yes, it was a big scandal, but it wasn't that he published, wrong information. But yeah, I mean, the truth is that sources always have motivations. We don't know what they are. We don't know if the motivations are because they've seen something wrong, because they have an agenda, they don't have the full context. And I think Sy wasn't always that comfortable when we were asking about those stories, but I think he also respected us when we had to. And particularly because, as you said before, people would assume that Sy Hersh and I do have some political, agreements. So we also had to talk about where we disagreed.
Yeah, and he acknowledges to you that he was wrong over the Assad reporting, and you put to him that he was too close to Assad himself because he'd met him a few times, and he acknowledges that. I think, though, there are other really uncomfortable moments which are to do with him himself. Like, he said yes to being the subject of a film after a long time of you asking him, but then he gets really uncomfortable and, in fact, tries to call it off, or does call it off in the middle of filming.
You know too much about what I'm doing, so I'd like to quit. What? No, let's just quit it.
As you said, I first asked him in 2005 and we sat down, we began production in 23. So it took a little while for him to warm up to the idea. But I have to say, it was very hard for him. At the same time, he was very committed to the process. He never turned away from a question. Some questions are hard for him, certainly if it's about a source. We weren't actually ever asking him about specific sources. We were asking about how does it work? How do you build trust? So he was very generous, even when uncomfortable, And I think for him, certain things, like why do you do what you do, is a question that he's not good at answering. It's not that he's withholding the answer. It's just he's not the best at answering that. And yeah, he did quit the film.
He lets you see boxes and boxes of documents, and there are names in those documents. And when he's filming with them, it clearly makes him understandably uncomfortable thinking about the people who might still be alive and whose names are on camera, as far as he knows.
Totally. I mean, you're a journalist as well. If somebody was sort of, looking at your notes, I mean, I think it did make him uncomfortable, just even though he trusted us and we had made it, we agreed at the beginning that we had an obligation to protect his sources as filmmakers. My reputation on source protection is very good. But what had happened when he quit the film was there was a couple of notebooks that he thought he had separated and they had gotten mixed in. But, he quit and it took about a weekend and then he was back. And as he was quitting, of course, it was very tense, but we felt confident that he would come back because he's known for being volatile.
Was it a weekend of frantic calls? Like, how hard did you have to work? Because you've invested a lot. Like, you've waited 18 years for him to say yes to the film.
Totally.
And then he basically pulls the plug halfway through.
Yeah, we were about a year in, we were deep in. I have a co-director, Mark Obenhaus. I was sort of the recipient of Sy's anger that day. Mark went and, who's known Sy for a long time, went to his house that night. Liz, his wife, who has, they've been together, as you learn in the film, for over 60 years. I think she said, Sy, you're not going to quit the film. I mean, so it took some time, but it was a tense day. It was. I mean, he wasn't pretending. He was seriously, I think, what I love about Sy and why Sy, for me as a filmmaker, I like his resistance, Like, I think as a documentary filmmaker, you should be really suspicious of somebody who would be eager to have a film made about them. And I like that he's very upfront about what he's feeling in the moment, right? Some people would smile and then, maybe leave a message and say, I'm thinking about quitting, Sy says it on camera.
And you did get him to talk about himself. And I was really interested in the details about his background, the fact that he doesn't come from privilege. His parents did not expect anything of him in educational terms. And also the fact that for someone whose father was a Jewish refugee, came to the United States with virtually nothing in 1920, his father's family is later massacred by the Nazis in Lithuania. And yet Sy doesn't, never in his father's lifetime, ask so many questions about having such an extraordinary personal history himself.
Right. I mean, his mother comes from Poland, Yiddish in the house, had very little. And his dad had a dry cleaning store, and Sy had a talent, with people. So he was working at the store, and his dad got sick with lung cancer. And, Sy talks about there being a lot of silence in the family, never hearing about the Holocaust, never learning what happened to the community that his father's from, learning about the world through the Book of the, signing up as a young boy to the Book of the Month Club. Nobody was saying, maybe this kid is bright. Maybe, we should, think about where he should be going to college. And, his dad told him that, he didn't need college because his dad knew that he was sick. And so Sy saw the world. The store was in the south side of Chicago. He saw inequality. He saw racism. He saw how the world worked. And I think that informs his distrust of power and skepticism around power.
I wonder if another thing you two have in common is that you could both be accused by some people of focusing too much on the ills of your own country, that your lens is often turned on America and America's abuse of power, whether internationally or domestically. Why is that your dominant focus through so much of your work?
One of the things about this film, and Sy's reporting at its best, it's fact-based. And he says in the film at some point, it doesn't matter what I believe, it matters what I can prove. I mean, I think we should all focus on the cultures that we know, and I don't think it's my role to make work in cultures that I don't understand or don't know. And the U.S. is a global power. And I think there's a myth of American exceptionalism that needs to be, I think, undone because, here we are. Look what's happened in Venezuela. Those are the actions of empires, right?
Since watching Cover Up, I've been thinking a lot about the films you've made, and you made a trilogy of films after 9/11, one about the occupation of Iraq, one about Guantanamo Bay, one about Edward Snowden, who I'm sure we'll talk about. But then recent events made me think how perhaps we are living in a very similar post 9/11 world now, in that war in Iraq was the war outside the international order and outside the UN. And what we've seen with Maduro in Venezuela also takes us into a realm outside what we've come to see as normal rules.
Yeah, I agree with you, absolutely. And I have a similar feeling of dread and anxiety that about what the U.S. is doing, about what will be the long-term consequences of these actions. Regime change never works out well. Even if you're talking about a dictator who's hated, and I had experience in Iraq. There was no love for Saddam Hussein, but people don't want to be occupied. People want self-determination. They don't want to be run by the United States. This is just basic. So this idea that we're going back to this sort of regime change foreign policy is terrifying to me, And what's also terrifying is, for me, I'm just going to say the failure of legacy media. I don't think, there were these stories after the kidnapping or extrajudicial, rendition, whatever we want to call it, of Maduro, and the news reports in, the Times, the New York Times, where it's a TikTok of how the CIA, how they were able to sneak in. And I just don't think it's news that the CIA is capable of kidnapping anyone on the planet. What I think we should be asking is, why are we doing this? And what are the really long histories and negative consequences of these kind of foreign interventions? I think those are the questions we need to ask.
But the administration, of course, would say, we are acting in the US's national interest because we don't want Venezuela's resources used by China or Russia.
The U.S. doesn't have the right to steal resources from other countries. I just think that the action of regime change, I think it's against international law. I'm not going to defend it. They pose no threat.
Is that what you would call it in Venezuela, regime change? Even though...
Well, what would you call it?
Maduro's deputy is, as in that the person who is supposedly in power in Venezuela today is Maduro's deputy.
Did you listen to the press conference that Trump did after, where he says, we control the country now? We're running the country now? How is that not regime change? And we're taking the oil. What's different about Iraq, I mean, there are many differences, okay? But in terms of the justification, or what we could call the cover-up, in Iraq, we pretended there was a connection between 9/11 and Iraq. There was kind of a cover story. And in Venezuela, there isn't one. We're taking over the country to steal the oil. I mean, it's all very blatant.
Can I go back to Iraq and to you making a film in 2004? The film that you made about life in Iraq under US occupation that led, I think, to you discovering that you were under surveillance yourself by the US authorities. Although I think it took quite a long time for you to have the official account of the extent of what happened. So take us through it. What started happening to you at the US border after you had made that film?
So I made a film in Iraq. I was there for 8 months. I filmed with an Iraqi family. I was filming the elections under occupation, which I feel is contradictory, but that's what I was doing. And then I was filming with the UN, private security contractors, and came back, edited the film. And once I started showing the film at film festivals is when I started being detained and interrogated at U.S. airports. And that was traveling both domestically. I was told I couldn't get a boarding pass until I was questioned, and it happened internationally. And it started 2006, and it continued for 6 years. And internationally, I was detained at least 50 times, and domestically, maybe another 40 times. And of course, you don't get a letter that you're on a terrorist watch list, right? At first, I went to the lawyers, the ACLU. They tried to get answers. No answers were forthcoming. I knew somebody from Iraq, and they put me in touch with somebody and just said, you are definitely on a list, and you should, be careful. And it was a terrorist watch list.
Just explain these detentions, the 50 times it happened. I mean, this is your delayed boarding, but you're eventually allowed onto a plane, or you miss planes and you can't get back to the US or travel as you want to?
It's different times. Sometimes I would be, the first time it happened, I was transiting in Vienna. There was a loudspeaker. I was asked to report to security. All of my luggage was taken. I was put in a van. I was taken to an X-ray area. Everything was searched. I was questioned by the head of security at the airport in Vienna. And ultimately, I was there going to a film festival in Sarajevo. And then I said, what are you doing? He said, well, you're on a list. And I said, I'm on a list. Whose list? He said, your country's list. And he said that we have a threat scale from 1 to 400, and that I was at 400 on their threat scale. So that was intimidating. And, I kept traveling. I was twice told I couldn't board a plane. So I wasn't on the full no-fly list, but I was on a terrorist watch list. And then at some point, in 2012, I decided to leave the United States to work because I felt I couldn't work safely going through this border. And I was working on a film. So I relocated to Berlin. And that's, I was there sort of in exile for 3 years, not working in the US.
I mean, it's very sobering hearing you describe it. And I think you did in the end get an acknowledgement from the US government over it.
But I do want to say that they didn't volunteer to tell me that I was on a terrorist watch list. I had to sue the government, which I did. The EFF, a great organization, they represented me, and we sued for a FOIA case. And so I got back about 1,000 documents of my FBI file, heavily redacted. There was a grand jury subpoena. They, all of my emails, bank records, et cetera, had been subpoenaed. So yeah, so I know I was on a list.
What was it like reading that FBI file?
There was a part of me that was a relief because it's validation, and you see the extent of it. I mean, they were sending FBI agents to my film screenings, and they're writing up reports of what I said in conversations. So it was validating. I knew it was happening. I had the evidence, but because the government would never acknowledge it, it was validating. And as a filmmaker and as an artist, I used it in my work. I hung it on museum walls, and because I talk about it a lot because usually the people who are put in these lists aren't white women who've won, journalism awards and film awards,
Muslim men, usually.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I think it will help people understand what you put into the film that you made about Edward Snowden, Citizenfour, because he is the former CIA contractor who revealed the extent of mass surveillance. By first coming to you, you were the person that he reached out to. Tell us about that. How did he first contact you? What did he say?
So Ed is in the military, he was in CIA, then he was at NSA. That's when he became aware of the extent of U.S. military, global surveillance. He knew I was being surveilled because I made a short film about it, about an NSA mathematician. And I was in Berlin, and I think he knew that I knew about surveillance and that I knew how dangerous it was and that I'd been directly impacted. And I also had a lot of skills in terms of encryption and source protection because I had to, once you're stopped at the airport a few times and your computer, and your phone are taken away from you, you learn how to encrypt, you learn how to protect things, and I had a lot of skills in terms of encryption technology. And he didn't reach out to me because I was a filmmaker, actually. He wasn't interested in any way in me making a film. He saw me as somebody that I could protect him and collaborate with news organizations to break the story. So that was his motivation. For many weeks when we were communicating, he used an alias throughout. He used the alias Citizen or Citizenfour. It changed many times. I had no idea who he was until right before meeting him.
But you did trust, Laura, did you, that he was genuine? Or did you think this was some kind of ruse or scam, given what you were living through at the time?
I had a spectrum of reactions. One was, I think it's legit, and holy shit, or I don't know what I can say on your podcast. I think this is legit. We're in danger, a lot of danger. Then there was another part of me was, it really could be an FBI entrapment. Because the FBI does do that. So I better be careful in terms of what I say, And at the time I had been documenting WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. So I was like, I think it's right. I think he's legit. Could be a FBI, or he could be a crazy, he could just be somebody who doesn't know anything. So I basically assumed that it was legit and went into a very extreme mode of digital security at that point. We communicated through encrypted email, but never would I log into my home network. I had a separate computer that was purchased with cash. I would go to random, I was in Berlin at the time, go to random cafes, use the internet there. What Snowden would call is you disassociate your metadata, or you divorce your metadata. So what's connected to your phone is not connected to these communications. And but I didn't know. It took 5 months, and then I finally saw a document, and the documents were staggering. Really staggering.
And you ended up being part of putting them out into the public domain, working with other journalists, meeting Snowden himself for the first time.
Yeah.
Of course, he then went on to get asylum in Russia, a country that is far from free, where there is no real freedom of expression. There is such an irony in that.
Yeah, well, it's been well reported. He was actually on his way to get to, I think, Ecuador. He had gotten an offer of asylum there, and he was in transit, and the U.S. revoked his passport. So he had a flight onward. There are all the images of the journalists who were going to go with him. There was a leg from Moscow to Cuba. So he was not planning to seek asylum in Russia, but the U.S. stranded him there. And once he was stranded there, he did seek asylum. And the U.S. also put, the global pressure on all of its European allies not to provide asylum was profoundly intense. Because I was in Germany, I know there was a lot of support to give him asylum there. It was that kind of level of pressure. So he wasn't there by choice.
And are you still in touch with him?
I am. Yeah. He's on the board of, I'm on the board of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which does press freedom. We provide digital security training for journalists. We have a Secure Drop, which is a system for sources to anonymously leak to newspapers that has been sort of set up in every major news organization in the U.S. and internationally. And so, yes, he's on the board, and his partner, it's in the film, but his partner went to Russia, and they're together. So I'm very happy he's not in a U.S. prison. I can tell you that. Because had he been arrested, we saw this with the reasons he ultimately agreed for me to film him is because I convinced him that he needed to explain his motivation for exposing this information around global mass surveillance. Because if he didn't, then the government was going to create the narrative. And, and the reason he did it is that he doesn't want to live in a world where everything is surveilled, He believes that the public should know the extent of its surveillance programs.
And there was such a huge outcry about it at the time, thanks to his work, thanks to your work. And yet, look at where we are today. In many ways, haven't most of us normalized surveillance because we're surrounded by CCTV and facial recognition? Technology has moved on so much. And this is reality. And we assume we're being surveilled all the time.
I have a few responses to that. One is, I don't think then what does that mean? We shouldn't, as journalists, inform the public. And I know you're not saying that, but I do think that there are tools we can use. Like as a journalist, you might have Signal on your phone, which is an encrypted app. Okay, you use Signal. Yeah. Did you use Signal before you heard of Edward Snowden's name? No, you probably didn't.
No, did it exist before that time?
There were technologies. Yeah. So I think that there are ways in which we know the dangers of these devices. And yes, of course, surveillance is ubiquitous. And, I think people should know their rights. And there are ways you can opt out. Like when you go to at least as a U.S. citizen, they want to do the biometric scan. I opt out. People don't know they can opt out of those things. There are certain things you can opt out and try to harden your security. But yes, and of course, and then you have also, all the tech companies that are surveilling us. But
But that's why, Laura, I guess what I wonder about is whether a lot of the things you care about, and I understand why you care about them, and they are really important, and your work has been incredibly valuable, but isn't the battle lost on some of those? I don't know to what extent a younger generation would particularly care about their data being used because they want the free services that come with that.
I think if you're, planning to participate in a demonstration right now in this country, I think you're going to care about how to avoid being surveilled. I think it really is. If you're living in a regime of authoritarian regime, about how dangerous surveillance is. I think that it really is a question of if you perceive your government as a threat to you, is the answer to that question. And I'm on, activist groups have all kinds of ways to try to avoid being surveilled. I'm not saying, it's easy. It's not easy. It's not easy for journalists either. But I believe we need to take these measures.
So come back to the wider context of the present day then. Would you say that Cover Up, which has this long sweep of history in it, from Seymour Hersh working on Vietnam right up to him taking calls from a source talking to him about Gaza, would you say that this is about the film is about the present day as much as it is about history?
Yeah, I think it's very much about the present day. That's why, that's compelled me to make it. I could have made other films, but I really feel this urgency around, the importance of both investigative journalism, about the responsibilities of legacy media, and then also that drawing connections across time, right? To draw connections of cycles of impunity that in this country, and this country being the United States, that these repetitions, like there are these lies, and then there are no consequences, which then sets the stage for where we are today. I think had there been consequences in previous wrongdoings and atrocities that were ordered from the top of the government, I think we'd be in a different moment.
But there were consequences, right? The soldiers involved in the abuse at Abu Ghraib, or the outcry over My Lai, or the Freedom Act that came in after the evidence on mass surveillance in the US.
Right, but consequences, I would say that in the case of Vietnam and Iraq, the soldiers were charged, but the chain of command weren't. None of those people ever faced any consequences. The people who often face consequences are the whistleblowers. You have General Taguba, who wrote the report about torture at Abu Ghraib. He then is told that he needs to, step down, from the military. It's the whistleblowers that face the consequences. So I think Nixon, they impeach, but then he's pardoned, or he resigns before they impeach him, and then he's pardoned by Ford. I think that cycle has to end.
And it's actually hard to think of a president these days choosing to step down in pretty much any circumstances.
Right.
Feels like that age is gone.
Unfortunately. Yeah, hopefully not. Sy says it in the film. Given the stakes, we can't just lay down and feel in despair, I feel the United States, we have press freedom in our Constitution. It's a right. And so we have to exercise that right. And I feel that when, Sy talks about self-censorship in the film, in the press, in the US, and like that, how distressing that is, because we have the right to be critical of the US government. It's not illegal, and we have to maintain those rights and use them well, use them wisely.
And yet Cover Up, your latest film, is going to be seen around the world in households on mobile devices, thanks to it being on Netflix. And we're also in an age where through phones in people's hands, we have evidence from many angles, often of the same incident.
Yeah. The incidents that had happened, the cold-blooded killing of Renee Good, where she was doing the protected right of assembly and protest is what was happening there. And we know what happened to her because it was documented by citizens, you could say citizen journalists. We also know George Floyd was killed 2 miles from there. And we know that because of a citizen journalist. And so, yes, I think those phones can also be forms of, that facts matter, we really do, and to have evidence of these crimes being committed. And what's very scary to me right now, particularly having gone through being labeled a terrorist threat, is that the Trump administration, immediately after the cold-blooded killing of a protester, called it, domestic terrorism. And that's terrifying, because I think that's playbook authoritarianism, where the rights that people have are labeled as national security threats, et cetera, enemies, the enemy within, et cetera.
It is a very stark time and a difficult time for many in which your film is coming out. But your source of hope, does it lie in individual acts that you do see, the acts of individual citizens?
Yeah. It's a dark time, but there are tipping points and things. And we have to keep fighting and sort of fighting in terms of, as a journalist, it means fact-finding and doing it without fear or favor. And no matter what political party it might anger, I speak out a lot against, I think the failure of the legacy media. I think we need a media that is, that rebuilds trust with the public. I think they've lost a lot of trust because they've, I think, often withheld information from the public. For instance, I don't think it was a secret that, Joseph Biden, wasn't fit to run for re-election. That should have been in the news and all the news all the time so we would have had a better outcome than we have now.
That's Laura Poitras speaking to me before we had the news of Alex Pretti's death on the streets of Minneapolis, gunned down by Border Patrol agents. He was 37, a US citizen, and worked as an intensive care nurse. And of course, it made me think of what Laura Poitras had said about the death of Renee Good, about citizen journalism, because again, this moment was captured on camera. And so I went back to her to talk again. Laura, hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay. Thank you for taking the time to talk again. Obviously, I've been thinking about you since the Alex Pretti news because of the way that you talked about Renee Good in our first conversation. Can I ask you then, when you heard the news of what happened to Alex Pretti, what was your immediate reaction?
The immediate reaction, it's horror, and I think anyone who sees this video, it's clear that this was an execution. He was shot from behind while being held down on the ground. So it was horror. And then waiting for the government narrative and then knowing that they were going to lie about it, but the extent of the lie was actually quite shocking. of how they tried to distort and create a narrative that did not align in any way with the facts that we could see with our eyes on these people who documented his killing, his execution.
So how important then was the role of video? Because again, this was something you talked about when we first spoke in relation to Renee Good and indeed George Floyd before that.
Right. I mean, going back to George Floyd, I mean, these killings, both of Alex Pretti and Renee Good, were within like 1 or 2 miles of where George Floyd was killed. And we know about what happened is because a citizen journalist picked up their phone, a teenager, in fact, Darnella Frazier, and she documented his killing. And what the police put out after they killed a man in broad daylight, they said, man dies in medical incident, like completely false. Thankfully, there was somebody there to document the murder of George Floyd. And thankfully, citizens are there documenting what ICE is doing, because these are executions, what we're seeing. These are point blank executions.
You heard, obviously, the use of the domestic terrorist label again, the portrayal of Alex Pretti as being someone who had gone armed to a protest, all of these kinds of characterizations.
What they're trying to do is create a state of terror. This killing of people using their protected rights of demonstrating or documenting ICE on the street. I mean, these are rights that we have in this country. It's outrageous. It's also not a surprise. It's kind of the playbook. And so we shouldn't be surprised, but we should be prepared. And I think there's an obligation on the press now not to replicate false narratives when they come from the government. The government does lie. We know that over and over. And what they're trying to do is, spin a narrative. And I think journalists have an obligation to challenge these narratives with facts and not to repeat them.
Don't you believe in reflecting another point of view in, like, what you see as parroting an authoritarian narrative, others might see as reflecting the official position, which is also important to understand what the administration is doing or trying to do?
Well, I mean, we have evidence that you can see that this person was not a threat, that he was on the ground, that he was shot from behind. So no, I don't think you should reflect something that's a lie, that's clearly a lie.
Do you think that this is a turning point for ICE and for the perception of the way that it's been operating? I mean, particularly even if you see the way President Trump is now talking about needing to de-escalate and wanting a full investigation.
Well, I mean, there are many people, in detention right now, under ICE, people who are dying that we don't see, we don't have cameras of. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think in terms of the international reputation of the United States, I mean, I think that is clearly shifted. I think people look at what's happening and they see these are paramilitaries. These are masked paramilitaries that are executing protesters on the streets. I think, this is their policy. Their policy is state terror.
But I wonder if you detect anything in conversations that you're having with people who might not previously have supported the way that you have long seen the exercise of US power. Are there people, neighbors, relatives, people who are further away from you than friends, who you think are changing their minds because of what's happened in the last few days?
I think that the videos that we see that were taken by people that day are undeniable. And yeah, I think anyone seeing a person being shot from behind is going to be outraged from that. And yes, I do hope it does create a tipping point. Whether or not that's going to change the policies of this administration, that I'm much more skeptical of.
And for you, awful as these moments are, and the footage of Alex Pretti has been seen around the world, does it give you renewed sense of purpose? Does something like that sort of renew your resolve to carry on doing the work you do?
I do think people who stand up and resist to defend basic rights. Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to be doing that. I think we cannot capitulate to sort of politics of despair, throw our hands up and not do anything. So, yeah. But
most people, the truth be told, aren't resisting. And what's the impact of that on you when you feel as strongly as you do?
Well, I mean, you look at a community like what's happening in Minneapolis. There are people who don't identify as activists who are coming together because they're seeing kids being kidnapped off the street. There's kids, they have ICE masked agents going into schools, and kidnapping, abducting people and hunting them. And I think people do stand up when they're confronted with that. I think we should all stand with the people of Minneapolis and learn from them and denounce ICE and abolish it. It needs to be abolished. I mean, this is a paramilitary force we don't even know the names of anyone who executed Alex Pretti. Will we ever know those names?
There is something that's positive that has happened since we last spoke. And as you're with us again, I just want to take the opportunity to mark that as well. You've had the news that Cover Up has been nominated for a BAFTA. Congratulations.
I appreciate that. The reason it's meaningful is because I believe Sai's body of work is meaningful and what it asks us to do in terms of being skeptical of government power over and over, which is what he does and which is what we're trying to say in the film. So yeah, it's meaningful.
Is that what you think has led to the nomination? That theme, that life's work is speaking to people right now because of the moment?
Yeah, I hope so. That's what I would hope. I mean, that's why we made the film, because I think Sai's body of work teaches us so much about how we navigate the present, and the role and the obligation of journalists to be dogged in and adversarial and unrelenting in questioning state power.